I sat alone in my truck that night. I was staring at the dark house I had just spent 8 months and $150,000 rebuilding. My parents had begged me to renovate it for their retirement, but this morning, the locks were changed. At exactly 11 p.m., my headlights caught something reflecting in the front window that should not have been there. It was a freshly printed for sale sign leaning against the custom oak cabinets I had built myself, and it listed my sister as the sole owner. They had secretly transferred the deed so she could sell my hard work for her lifestyle fund. Before I tell you how my company's mechanics lien froze her entire sale, take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I read every single one. I am Ava Birdie. I am 34 years old. I own a boutique design build firm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. My days are measured in square footage, permit approvals, and supply chain logistics. I run crews of electricians, plumbers, and roofers. I am used to managing chaos. Before a decade, my most exhausting job was being the dependable daughter. Every family has an invisible ledger. In mine, my sister got the grace, and I got the work. My parents, Richard and Helen, lived in a sprawling 1980s colonial. It was a house frozen in time. The floors sloped. The doorways were too narrow for a wheelchair or a walker. The first-floor bathroom still had the original pink tile from the Reagan administration. Last Thanksgiving, my father pulled me aside. He walked slowly, leaning heavily on the kitchen island. He told me his knees were failing. My mother chimed in, pouring coffee with trembling hands, saying they were terrified of falling on the steep oak staircase. They wanted to age in place. They wanted to stay in the home where we grew up. They did not have the cash for a massive overhaul. I did not hesitate. I stepped right into the role they carved out for me. I told them I would handle the project at cost. I would waive my contractor fee. I would fund the materials through my business lines of credit. For 8 months, that house consumed my life. I pulled permits in January. We gutted the first floor to the studs by February. I widened every doorway to 36 inches for future accessibility. I installed a zero-entry shower with brushed nickel grab bars. I spent late evenings on my hands and knees laying radiant heat tubing under the bathroom floor so my mother's feet would not get cold in the winter. My clothes permanently smelled like drywall dust and cut pine. I missed dinners with friends. I neglected my own paying clients. I poured my literal sweat and my company's capital into making that house a safe haven for 2 aging people. I thought I was securing their future. I thought I was finally earning the quiet nod of approval my father rarely gave me. I viewed the project as an investment in family security. I was wrong. The widened doorways, the new copper plumbing, the custom cabinetry, none of it was meant for them to age in place. It was a calculated staging process. They were letting me flip their house for free. While I was pulling building permits, they were drafting property transfer documents. They weaponized my competence to bail out the one person in our family who had never picked up a hammer in her life. The trap was set long before the first wall was ever torn down. In the design and construction industry, paper is your only armor. If a client wants to change the color of their kitchen cabinets from alabaster to bone white after the paint is ordered, we draft a change order. We sign it, they sign it. Every contractor operating a solvent business knows the golden rule of the trade. You never swing a sledgehammer, you never order materials, and you never start demolition without a legally binding signed contract. I enforce this rule with rigid precision for every single client on our roster. My boutique firm did not survive its first 5 years by operating on good faith or verbal promises. We survived on airtight documentation. But with my parents, I took off my armor. I made the fatal, emotionally driven mistake of operating on a handshake. The mechanism of my mistake began in my office on a Tuesday morning. My business partner, Sarah, manages our accounts payable and vendor relations. She is a pragmatist. When I told her I was blocking out my schedule to oversee a full first-floor remodel for my parents, she opened our master spreadsheet and asked for the contract file. I told her there was no file. I explained that I was going to front the capital for the lumber, the drywall, the fixtures, and the subcontractor labor using our company's commercial line of credit. Sarah stopped typing. She looked at me across the desk and asked how we were getting paid. I recited the plan my parents had laid out for me over a Sunday dinner. They were going to apply for a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC. Because their 1980s colonial had appreciated over the decades, they had equity. But the house was dated, and the bank would only lend them a certain percentage of its current, unrenovated value. The strategy was simple. I would use my business accounts to fund the renovation up front. Once the custom kitchen was installed, the floors leveled, and the bathroom modernized, the property value would skyrocket. The bank would reappraise the house at the new, much higher premium. My parents would then close on the HELOC and use the bank funds to reimburse me for the exact cost of the materials and the labor. Sarah picked up her pen and tapped it against her notepad. She warned me, in clear and uncompromising terms, that using our commercial credit line to float a six-figure residential project without a master service agreement was reckless. She told me to draft a basic contract. It did not have to be adversarial. It just had to state the terms of the reimbursement. I brushed her off. I got defensive. I told Sarah that these were my parents, not some random house flippers trying to dodge an invoice. I rationalized that drawing up legal paperwork for my own mother and father would feel insulting. It would look like I did not trust them. The truth was much heavier and much more pathetic. I was 34 years old, I ran a successful company, I owned my own home, and I was still desperately chasing my parents' elusive approval. For my entire life, my achievements were met with polite nods. When I won bids for commercial restaurant build-outs, my father would change the subject to the weather. When our firm was featured in a regional architectural magazine, my mother left the issue sitting unread on her coffee table. I operated under the silent, crushing belief that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved myself useful enough, they would finally look at me with the pride they reserved for other things. By waiving my profit margin entirely and acting as their private bank, I thought I was securing that pride. I wanted to be the hero daughter. I wanted to swoop in, solve their aging-in-place crisis, and create a beautiful, safe environment for their retirement. I traded my professional boundaries for the illusion of a loving family dynamic. That naive need for validation was my greatest mistake. The financial reality of that mistake set in quickly. To fund the project, I tapped $150,000 from my business credit line. In construction, cash flow is the lifeblood of operations. By tying up that much capital in my parents' property, I handicapped my own firm. When an opportunity arose to bid on a lucrative municipal contract in neighboring Montgomery County, I had to pass. We simply did not have the liquid capital to float the upfront bond required for the bid. I was literally shrinking my own livelihood to expand my parents' asset. I did not complain. I spent my days managing my paying clients, and I spent my evenings and weekends at my parents' house. I demolished the old kitchen island with a sledgehammer. I hauled out hundreds of pounds of broken tile in thick canvas contractor bags. I coordinated the plumbing rough-ins and argued with the municipal zoning inspector over the permit for the widened back deck. My parents moved into a short-term luxury apartment lease during the heavy demolition. They would occasionally drop by the site. They never brought a broom. They never offered to sweep up the sawdust. My father would stand in the center of the framed-out living room, point at the ceiling, and ask if the recessed lighting could be upgraded to a smart system. I said yes. My mother would trace her fingers over the unpainted drywall and casually mention that soapstone countertops would look much more refined than the quartz we had originally discussed. I absorbed the price difference. I viewed my exhaustion as a down payment on their affection. I did not realize I was handing them my vulnerability, and they were viewing it as a subsidy. I thought we were operating under a shared understanding of familial support. I was blind to the actual ledger being balanced in the background. While I was obsessing over structural load paths and custom cabinet joints, I missed the subtle shifts in their behavior. I did not notice that my father was suddenly taking private phone calls in the driveway when I was around. I did not question why my mother kept asking for the precise timeline of the final township inspection, framing her questions around her eagerness to move back in. I was too busy working to see the architecture of the betrayal being built right behind me. Because while I was pouring my money into their foundation, my younger sister was quietly drowning in a crisis of her own, and my parents had already decided who was going to pay to save her. While I spent my Tuesday evenings on my hands and knees pressing porcelain subway tile into wet mortar, my younger sister was 30 miles south, quietly drowning in the sea of her own inventory. Chloe is 31 years old. She is 3 years younger than me, but in the family ledger, she might as well be a protected infant. She has always lived inside a bubble of parental intervention. When she failed a college semester, my parents paid for private tutors to salvage her transcript. When she backed her first car into a retaining wall, my father quietly paid the body shop in cash so her insurance premiums would not rise. She never learned the texture of a consequence. 3 years ago, Chloe opened a high-end wellness boutique in an upscale Philadelphia neighborhood. She called it Aura. It sold imported silk robes, $80 botanical serums, and organic bath soaks. The storefront projected an image of effortless, curated wealth. She had frosted glass doors, a minimalist aesthetic, and thousands of followers on social media. But retail is a brutal math equation. You either have foot traffic or you have debt. Chloe had debt. Behind the aesthetic Instagram posts, her business was hemorrhaging cash. I did not know the exact numbers at the time, but the signs of a failing enterprise are universal if you know where to look. I saw the small cracks in her facade during family dinners. She stopped talking about her quarterly sales. She started taking panicked, hushed phone calls in the driveway, her voice tight and high. I noticed she had a cracked windshield on her leased luxury SUV that went unfixed for months. A woman selling a lifestyle of elite wellness does not drive a car with shattered glass unless she lacks the $200 to pay the insurance deductible. She was dodging vendors, extending net 30 payment terms into net 90, and surviving on minimum credit card payments. My parents noticed the cracks too. Richard and Helen are not cartoon villains. They do not operate out of a desire to cause pain. Their actions were born of a very specific, quiet, middle-class panic. They had spent 3 decades curating an image of a successful, flawless family. The idea of Chloe failing, the thought of her declaring bankruptcy and moving back into her childhood bedroom, was a social humiliation they could not stomach. They viewed her fragility as an emergency that required immediate, decisive intervention. But my parents were retired. They lived on fixed pensions and Social Security. They did not have the liquid cash to bail out a failing commercial lease. What they did have was a house, and they had a daughter who owned a construction firm willing to work for free. This is where the psychological rationalization took root. How do parents justify stealing from one child to save another? They use a warped scale of competence. They looked at me and saw a woman with a commercial truck, a thriving business, and a thick skin. I solve problems for a living. They looked at Chloe and saw a delicate flower about to be crushed by a harsh economy. They engineered a narrative where I was wealthy enough to absorb a 6-figure financial hit, while Chloe was too fragile to survive a missed rent payment. In their minds, they were not robbing me. They were simply reallocating family resources to the child who needed it most. My competence became my penalty. I should have seen the math changing. I should have recognized the subtle shifts in their dialogue. But I was too tired. My muscles ached from pulling wire and hauling drywall. My brain was occupied with building codes and municipal inspections. During the 6th month of the renovation, my mother started visiting the job site more often. She would walk through the framed-out rooms with a steaming cup of tea, stepping carefully over my power cords. One afternoon, I was installing a deep, fire-clay apron front sink in the kitchen island. I was covered in sawdust and measuring the countertop overhang. My mother ran her hand over the smooth quartz surface. She did not ask if the sink was deep enough to wash large roasting pans. She did not ask if the height was comfortable for her back. Instead, she asked if the open-concept layout was the kind of thing young professional buyers were looking for these days. I wiped sweat off my forehead with the back of my wrist. I told her yes, open layouts sell fast and fetch a premium on the market. I thought she was just proud of the modern design. I assumed she was marveling at the new equity being added to her retirement nest egg. A week later, my father provided another clue I blindly ignored. He stood in the driveway while I loaded my compound miter saw into the bed of my truck. He held a printed sheet of paper folded in half. He casually asked me what the current price per square foot was running in our zip code. He wanted to know if a fully renovated first floor pushed a house out of the median price bracket for the neighborhood. I leaned against my tailgate and gave him the current real estate figures, assuming he was updating his personal financial spreadsheet. I did not realize he was calculating his exact profit margin. While I was pulling building permits for the electrical upgrades, my parents were quietly sitting in a notary office. They knew they could not get a traditional bank loan to bail out a failing retail business with no collateral. The interest rates were too steep, the underwriting process too rigorous. But a residential property featuring a brand new, custom renovation was a liquid asset waiting to be tapped. They were already calculating how to liquidate my labor. 8 months of exhausting, back-breaking work were coming to an end. The heavy lifting was finished. The walls were painted a soft, neutral gray. The zero-entry shower was grouted and sealed. I was down to the final punch list. I spent my last week on site installing custom brass hardware on the cabinets and polishing the new hardwood floors until they gleamed. I was physically drained, but I felt a deep, quiet pride. I had built a beautiful, safe space for the people who raised me. I packed up my truck on a rainy Monday evening. I planned to return the next morning to do a final walkthrough, test the appliances one last time, and hand my parents the keys to their upgraded life. I drove home feeling like I had finally earned my place in the family. I had no idea the keys sitting in my pocket were already obsolete. I had no idea my role as the dependable daughter had just reached its expiration date, setting the stage for a discovery that would permanently alter my reality. I had planned my entire week around this Tuesday. It was raining, a steady, freezing Pennsylvania drizzle that turned the sky the color of wet cement. I parked my work truck in the familiar driveway. The bed of the truck was empty, except for a heavy cardboard box sitting on the passenger seat. Inside the box were 50 unlacquered brass cabinet handles. They were heavy, expensive, and back-ordered for 3 months. Installing them was the final item on my punch list. It was the finish line of an 8-month marathon. I remember feeling a sense of relief settling into my shoulders. I pulled my heavy canvas jacket tight against the rain and walked up the front steps. I had poured the concrete for these steps myself back in April. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my brass key. I slid it into the deadbolt. It stopped halfway. It refused to engage the pins. I pulled it out, wiped it on my jeans, and tried again. The metal ground against the cylinder. Contractors deal with site anomalies daily. Wood swells in the humidity. Foundations settle. I assumed the door frame had shifted from the recent temperature drop. I pulled my heavy-duty flashlight from my belt and shined it directly onto the lock mechanism. The lock had not shifted. The hardware was different. The old deadbolt had been replaced with a high-security cylinder. I still did not panic. Sometimes subcontractors change locks if a key goes missing to secure the site. I walked down the side path, the gravel crunching under my work boots. I turned the corner to the back patio, intending to use the sliding glass doors. That is when I saw it. Hanging from the brushed nickel handle of the newly installed French doors was a heavy gray metal box with a combination dial. A real estate agent lockbox. I stopped walking. The rain hit the hood of my jacket. I stepped up to the glass doors, cupped my hands around my eyes to block the glare, and pressed my face against the cold pane. The interior was dark, but the gray light from the windows illuminated the kitchen. The staging was immaculate. Someone had placed a bowl of artificial lemons on the quartz island. And right there, leaning against the custom oak cabinets I had built and sanded by hand, was a glossy wooden sign. The bold letters were facing the front window. For sale. I did not scream. I did not pick up a brick and shatter the glass. I told myself I was a business owner, and when a job site is compromised, you react with data, not emotion. But my body betrayed my logic. A wave of profound, acidic nausea hit the back of my throat. I stumbled back from the glass, dropping to one knee on the wet patio. My fingers dug into the heavy cardboard box of brass handles I was carrying. Gripping the edges so hard, the cardboard tore and my knuckles went entirely white. I stayed there for a full minute, breathing in the freezing rain, trying to force my stomach to stop heaving. Only when the physical shock subsided did I step back under the deep overhang of the roof to shield my phone. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled it out of my pocket. Every county in Pennsylvania maintains a public portal for property records. Bucks County makes it very efficient to search by parcel number or street address. It is a tool I use every week to verify property lines before pouring foundations. I opened my mobile browser. I typed in the address of the house I grew up in. The database took 4 seconds to load. I tapped on the transaction history tab. There was a new entry at the very top of the ledger. It had been filed 21 days ago. The document type was listed as a quitclaim deed. For those outside of the real estate industry, a quitclaim deed is the fastest, most efficient way to transfer property ownership. It requires no title search. It offers no warranties. It simply signs over whatever interest the grantor has directly to the grantee. It is almost exclusively used between close family members. I zoomed in on the scanned document. The grantors were listed as Richard and Helen Birdie. The grantee was Chloe Birdie. Consideration paid was $1. The notary stamp belonged to a woman at a local bank branch 2 miles away. I stood there and looked at the date again. 21 days ago. I cross-referenced the date with the calendar on my phone. 21 days ago, I was inside that house, on my hands and knees in the half bathroom, grouting the floor tile. I remembered that specific afternoon because my mother had stopped by. She had brought me a paper cup of black coffee. She had stood in the doorway, watched me wipe the excess grout with a sponge, and told me I was working too hard. On the exact same day she handed me that coffee, she had driven to a bank and signed away the house. I opened a standard real estate app on my phone. I typed in the address. The property was listed as active on the market. It had gone live 4 hours ago. The asking price was $650,000. Before I started the renovation, the house had appraised at $450,000. My labor, my materials, and my depleted business credit line had created exactly $200,000 of fresh equity. I swiped through the listing photos. The agent had hired a professional photographer. The wide-angle lens made the open-concept living room look sprawling. I saw the zero-entry shower I had built so my father would not trip. I saw the widened doorways I had framed so a wheelchair could pass through. The listing description boasted about the modern layout. It called the property a turnkey masterpiece perfect for a young family. The math of their betrayal was cold, elegant, and devastating. My parents had never intended to apply for a home equity line of credit. They had never intended to pay me back from a bank draw. They bypassed the bank entirely. By transferring the deed directly to my sister, they gave her a liquid asset to sell. Chloe could take the $650,000, pay off the remaining small mortgage, and pocket the rest to save her failing wellness boutique. But the brilliance of their plan was the legal insulation. By removing their names from the deed, my parents no longer owned the property I had improved. I could not place a lien against them. Chloe owned the house now. But Chloe had never hired me. Chloe had never made a verbal promise to repay me. I had no text messages or emails from my sister authorizing construction. They had built a legal fortress around my money. They handed a life raft to the golden child, and they used my spine as the timber to build it. They expected me to look at the complexity of the paperwork, realize I had no formal contract, and simply give up. They counted on my lifelong habit of swallowing my own discomfort to keep the family peace. They assumed I would absorb a catastrophic financial loss just to avoid making Thanksgiving awkward. I stood on the patio for a long time. The rain soaked through my jacket. I felt the cold water slide down my neck. I looked at the heavy cardboard box of brass handles sitting on the wet patio table. I left it there. I put my phone back in my pocket. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the urge to cry. The desperate, decades-long need to earn my parents' approval vanished instantly. It was replaced by a very specific, very dangerous kind of clarity. I walked back to my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat. I turned the ignition and put the truck in drive. I was not heading back to my office to lick my wounds. I was heading to the luxury apartment my parents were renting. It was time to let them know I could read a ledger just as well as they could. I drove straight from the house to the luxury apartment complex my parents were renting. It was a sterile, new construction building on the north side of town. The lobby smelled like piped-in lavender and floor wax. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The water from my jacket dripped onto the polished brass trim of the elevator car. I did not care. I used the spare key my mother had given me to feed their cat. The door swung open. The scene inside was aggressively normal. It was a Tuesday evening. The local news was playing on the flat-screen television. My father was sitting in a leather recliner, his feet propped up. My mother was standing at the kitchen island, tossing a salad in a wooden bowl. The air smelled of roasting chicken and rosemary. They had built a comfortable, temporary domestic life, funded entirely by their impending theft. I walked into the living room. My work boots left wet tracks on the pristine beige carpet. My father looked up, surprised, the remote control resting on his knee. My mother stopped tossing the salad. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my keys. Yelling implies a loss of control. I reached inside my damp jacket and pulled out the folded sheets of paper I had just downloaded from the county portal. The quitclaim deed. The active real estate listing. I walked over to the glass coffee table and placed the papers face up. My mother wiped her hands on a linen towel. She walked over, picked up the pages, and adjusted her reading glasses. I waited for the panic. I waited for the flush of guilt, the stammering apology of a parent caught in a lie. It never came. Her reaction was chillingly calm. She set the papers back on the glass. She looked at me, not with shame, but with mild annoyance, as if I had interrupted a quiet evening with a petty administrative complaint. She did not apologize. She rationalized. She spoke in the soothing, condescending tone she used when I was a child asking for a toy we could not afford. "Ava, you are a smart girl," she said. "You own a thriving company. You have accounts and accountants. You can just write off the lumber and the tile as a business loss on your taxes. The government will absorb it." I stared at her. The profound ignorance of her statement hung in the air. You cannot write off $150,000 of stolen capital as a simple tax deduction to balance out a family betrayal. But she believed her own logic. She had convinced herself that because my business was solvent, money was an abstract concept to me. I turned to my father. He is a man who spent his life avoiding friction. He stared at the carpet. He refused to look at the papers on the table. "Richard," I said. I used his first name. It was the first time in my life I had ever done that. "Explain this." He shifted his weight in the recliner. He mumbled toward the floor. He said Chloe was facing ruin. The commercial landlord for her boutique was threatening to sue her for back rent. Her suppliers had cut her off. He said they had to do something fast. They needed liquid cash, and the house was the only asset they had. They believed they were executing a necessary triage. In medical terms, triage is the assignment of degrees of urgency to wounds to decide the order of treatment. In my family, triage meant amputating my financial stability to stitch up my sister's vanity project. They had decided I was the strong limb. I could survive the cut. Chloe was the weak limb. She required the blood. I told them the house had an asking price of $650,000. I told them I expected my $150,000 reimbursement wired to my commercial account the morning the escrow closed. I told them I was not a charity. Before my father could answer, a third voice cut through the room. It came from the hallway leading to the guest bedroom. Chloe stepped out. I did not know she was there. She was wearing a pristine cashmere sweater and holding a glass of sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the rim. But what caught my attention was her other hand. She was casually massaging an $80 botanical serum from her failing boutique into her cuticles. A brand new heavy gold watch glinted on her wrist in the living room light. It was an anticipatory purchase. A luxury celebration of her impending payday, funded entirely by the equity I had literally bled into the floorboards. She looked incredibly well-rested. While I had been breathing drywall dust and skipping meals to hit their construction deadlines, she had been hiding in their guest room, spending my labor. She walked past me, still rubbing the expensive serum into her skin, and stood next to my mother. The battle lines were drawn physically in the room. The three of them on one side of the coffee table, me on the other. Chloe took a sip of her water. She looked at me with flat, unbothered eyes. "You are not getting a wire transfer, Ava," she said. Her voice was cold. It lacked any trace of sibling warmth or basic gratitude. She spoke to me like a collections agent dismissing a fraudulent claim. There was no contract, she continued. You did the work on Mom and Dad's house. You never asked them to sign anything. And you certainly never asked me to sign anything. From a legal standpoint, that renovation was a gift to the family. And now the family is using that gift to survive. The word gift hung in the room. It was a heavy, calculated word. Someone had coached her to say it. A lawyer, a real estate agent. Someone had told her that without a master service agreement, my 8 months of labor was nothing more than a daughter doing a favor for her aging parents. I looked at my mother. She nodded slightly, affirming Chloe's statement. My father kept his eyes on the floor. They expected me to swallow the loss. They expected me to walk back out into the rain, climb into my truck, and accept the destruction of my company's cash flow in the name of family peace. They relied on the social contract that dictates you do not take your own blood to court. They assumed my desire to be loved was stronger than my instinct to survive. I realized in that exact second that the family I had spent my life trying to impress did not exist. They were a mirage built on my willingness to be useful. I did not argue. I did not try to convince them of the morality of the situation. Arguing with people who have justified your exploitation is a waste of oxygen. The emotional battle was over. They had won that round. They held the deed, they held the listing, and they held the united front. I reached down and picked up the damp property records from the glass table. I folded them carefully and slid them back into my jacket pocket. I will see you all later, I said. The quietness of my exit unnerved them. Chloe shifted her weight. My mother took a half step forward. They had prepared for a screaming match. They had braced for tears and slammed doors. They did not know how to process a calm withdrawal. I walked out of the apartment and let the heavy door click shut behind me. I rode the elevator back down to the lobby. The scent of lavender made me nauseous. I walked out into the freezing rain and sat in the driver's seat of my truck. I did not turn the key. I stared at the dashboard. The emotional fog was gone. If they wanted to use the law to insulate their theft, I would have to use the law to dismantle their shelter. But the next morning, sitting across from a man who charged $400 an hour, I would learn just how massive the wall they built truly was. I pulled into the parking garage of my law firm at 8 in the morning. I had not slept. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and black. I walked into the lobby of the building feeling a strange, hollow sense of adrenaline. My commercial attorney is a man named David. He handles my vendor disputes, drafts my subcontractor agreements, and shields my design and build firm from liability. He is pragmatic, sharp, and entirely unsentimental. I sat in his waiting room, drinking bitter coffee from a paper cup, expecting to walk out with a swift, vindicating strategy. I expected him to draft a single, terrifying cease and desist letter that would freeze my sister's real estate listing and force my parents to release my money by the end of the week. David called me into his office. The room smelled like old paper and expensive leather. I sat in the client chair across his wide mahogany desk and laid out the facts. I kept my voice flat and factual. I handed him the quitclaim deed I had printed from the county portal. I handed him the active property listing boasting about the new custom kitchen and the widened, accessible doorways. I told him about the handshake agreement in my parents' dining room. I detailed the $150,000 I had pulled from my business credit line to fund the materials and subcontractor labor. Finally, I described the confrontation in my parents' apartment the night before and my sister's chilling assertion that the renovation was a legally unprotected gift. I leaned back in the leather chair and asked David to file a mechanics lien against the property immediately. I wanted to block the sale before Chloe could find a buyer. David did not pick up his pen. He did not draft a letter. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the empty space on his desk where a master service contract should have been. He let out a slow, heavy breath. He looked at me and delivered a reality check that felt like a physical blow to the chest. He explained that the legal system does not care about family loyalty. It does not care about emotional betrayal or moral obligations. The law only cares about what you can prove on paper. He told me that placing a mechanics lien without a signed contract is highly perilous in the state of Pennsylvania. A lien is a hostile act. It formally clouds a property title, warning any potential buyer or lender that there is an unresolved debt attached to the house. If we filed a lien to stop Chloe's sale without an airtight contract to back it up, her lawyer would immediately file a countersuit for slander of title. I asked him what that meant for me and my business. David leaned forward, folding his hands over the pristine desk. He explained that if a judge determined my lien was frivolous or vindictive because I lacked a formal contract, I would not just lose the $150,000 I had already spent. I would be held legally liable for any financial damages Chloe suffered because her sale was delayed. If a prospective buyer walked away because of the clouded title, Chloe could sue my company for the lost revenue. She could sue me for her attorney fees. Placing the lien without a contract was not a swift strike. It was handing my sister a loaded weapon to destroy my firm. David picked up the quitclaim deed and tapped it against his palm. He told me my parents had executed a brilliant, ruthless defensive maneuver. By transferring the deed to Chloe before the house went on the market, the legal target moved. Chloe was now the sole, undisputed owner of the property. But Chloe never hired me. I had no text messages from my sister authorizing construction. I had no emails from her discussing tile choices, plumbing fixtures, or flooring materials. From a strict legal standpoint, I had performed unprompted, unauthorized labor on a house my sister now owned. My parents had effectively laundered my money through real estate. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked David what our actual options were. If a mechanic's lien was too dangerous, how do I recover the capital that was currently bleeding my business dry? He said the only path forward was to sue for unjust enrichment and breach of a verbal contract. We would have to prove that a verbal agreement existed, that I performed the work under the expectation of payment, and that my family knowingly accepted the benefit of that work without compensating me. David did not sugarcoat the reality of this path. He told me it would be a brutal, exhausting process. It would take months. It would require formal depositions, extensive discovery, and likely a mandatory mediation process. He told me his firm required a $15,000 upfront retainer just to draft the initial civil filings and begin the discovery phase. And then he delivered the final crushing piece of resistance. He looked me directly in the eye and warned me that even if we spent the money and the time, there was a very real chance a judge might look at the familial relationship, look at the utter lack of paperwork, and rule the entire 8-month renovation a family gift. Judges are naturally skeptical of intra-family lawsuits. They often view them as personal grievances dragging down the court docket. The resistance was immense. My parents and my sister had not just stolen from me, they had used my own emotional blind spot to build an impregnable legal fortress. By desperately wanting their approval, by treating them like family instead of clients, I had handed them the high ground. My professional negligence created the exact loophole they were now exploiting. I sat in David's office and calculated the risk. My business credit line was maxed out. I was already turning down paying jobs because I lacked the liquid capital to float the material costs. Handing David $15,000 in cash right now would drain my firm's operating reserves. It would put my own livelihood on the edge of a cliff. I had to make a choice. I could walk away. I could let Chloe sell the house, pocket the $650,000, and save her failing wellness boutique. I could eat the catastrophic financial loss, write it off over the next decade, and quietly sever all ties with my family. It would be the safest option. It would protect my business from a slander of title lawsuit. It was exactly the option my parents were banking on. They were relying on my lifelong habit of retreating to avoid conflict. Or I could go to war against my own blood. I could risk the reputation of my firm, the remaining cash in my bank account, and my own sanity to fight a battle I might easily lose. I looked at the glossy real estate flyer sitting on the desk. I saw the image of the custom oak cabinets I had sanded until my fingers bled. I thought about the word gift falling from my sister's mouth in that sterile luxury apartment. I thought about the decades I spent shrinking myself to fit into their ledger. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my commercial checkbook. I wrote a check for $15,000 and slid it across the mahogany desk. David looked at the check. He did not smile. He picked it up and placed it in a file folder. He told me that if we were going to prove a verbal contract and unjust enrichment, I needed to give him something to work with. He needed a paper trail. He told me to go home and find every receipt, every timestamp, and every text message I possessed. I walked out of his office and back into the parking garage. The hollow adrenaline was gone, replaced by a heavy, grounding focus. The legal wall was massive, but I knew how to dismantle structures. I just had to reconstruct 8 months of history, and I had to do it before Chloe's real estate agent found a buyer. I chose war. But let me be clear about what going to war against your own family actually looks like. It is not glamorous. It does not look like a television drama where you deliver a crushing monologue and walk away victorious. War is fought in the quiet, exhausting hours of the night. It is a grueling slog through the paperwork of your own gullibility. Because I lacked a master service agreement, I had to build a legally binding paper trail backward. I had to prove a negative. I had to prove I was not a charity. For the next 3 weeks, my dining room table became a forensic laboratory. I lived on black coffee and adrenaline, cross-referencing credit card statements with GPS delivery timestamps to prove every piece of lumber and inch of copper pipe was installed at my parents' address. The collateral damage was immediate. My fractured focus cost my firm a lucrative municipal bid in New Hope. I was hemorrhaging fresh capital just to chase down stolen capital. But the financial receipts only proved I spent the money. They did not prove my family intended to pay me back. For that, I needed to scour my digital history. Reading through months of family group chats was a specific kind of psychological torture. I was hunting for legal acknowledgement of debt among thumbs-up emojis and mundane updates, filtering out the noise of a family that didn't exist. Then, on a third Sunday, at 2 a.m, my exhausted eyes caught a sequence of gray and blue text bubbles from early April. It was a Thursday afternoon. We were in the middle of the rough plumbing inspection. I had texted my father a photo of a receipt for the custom fireclay kitchen sink. It was an expensive fixture, well outside the original budget, but my mother had insisted she needed it for washing large pots. My text read, "The farmhouse sink just arrived. It put me $3,000 over the material budget for the month. I had to put it on a company card. Can we hold off on ordering the patio doors until next week so I can balance the accounts?" My father replied 12 minutes later. His text read, "Do not worry about the budget, Ava. Order the doors so we stay on schedule. Once the house is finished and we get the new appraisal, we will pull the money from the home equity loan and reimburse you for everything. Keep tracking the receipts. You will get every dollar back." I stopped breathing. I stared at the glowing screen. I read the words again. "Once the house is finished, get the new appraisal. Pull the money from the home equity loan. Reimburse you for everything." He had put the entire fraudulent mechanism in writing. He acknowledged the mechanism of the loan. He acknowledged the expectation of repayment. He gave a directive to keep working based on that financial promise. I kept scrolling. I found 2 more texts scattered across different weeks. One from my mother discussing the specific interest rate on the equity line they were supposedly applying for to cover my invoices. Another from my father, confirming a wire transfer would happen the day the bank approved the draw. 3 texts. Out of thousands of messages, I found 3 critical strings of dialogue. It was a thin foundation. It was not a notarized contract with signatures and dates, but it was no longer just a he said, she said argument. I had objective proof that my parents understood they were incurring a debt and that I was performing the labor under the explicit promise of financial compensation. I printed those 3 screenshots on thick, glossy paper. I placed them in a red folder, separate from the financial receipts. I packed everything into my leather tote bag. The sun was starting to come up over the tree line outside my window. I watched the sky turn a pale, bruised purple. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, and entirely focused. I had the paper trail. I had the numbers. I had the written acknowledgement. It was enough to arm my attorney. It was enough to draft the legal paperwork. I took a shower, put on a clean suit, and drove straight back to downtown Doylestown. It was time to introduce a massive, immovable obstacle into Chloe's real estate transaction. She wanted a fast, quiet payday. I was about to drop an anvil on her closing date. I walked back into David's office and placed the red folder on his mahogany desk. I did not sit down. I stood there while he opened it and read the 3 printed screenshots. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a heavy brass clock on his bookshelf. I watched his eyes scan the words my father had typed in early April. David read the sentence about the bank appraisal. He read the promise to pull money from the home equity loan. He read the directive to keep working. He closed the folder. He looked up at me. He picked up his gold pen. He said we had our paper trail. It was not a formal master service agreement, but it was enough to satisfy the legal threshold for intent. We were going to war. Real estate transactions operate on a rigid timeline. There is a delicate choreography of inspections, appraisals, and financing that all leads to a single, high-stakes event called closing. Chloe had found a buyer quickly. The market for turnkey properties in Bucks County was competitive. Her buyer had waived the inspection contingency. They were scheduled to sign the final paperwork and wire $650,000 into an escrow account on a Friday morning. David drafted the legal paperwork on Wednesday. He compiled the itemized list of materials. He attached the subcontractor invoices. He included the 3 critical text messages as exhibits of a verbal contract. The total debt owed to my firm was calculated down to the penny. $150,427. 48 hours before Chloe was scheduled to sit at a polished conference table and collect her unearned payday, David filed the mechanic lien with the county prothonotary office. When you file a lien against a residential property, the system does not send out a warning. There is no courtesy phone call. The trap simply springs shut in the background. On Thursday afternoon, the title company representing Chloe's buyer ran their final routine public records check. They do this to ensure the property is free of encumbrances before the bank releases the mortgage funds. The search query hit the county database. The title came back clouded. The transaction froze instantly. David called me at 4 p.m. to confirm the strike. He told me the buyer agent had called Chloe's listing agent in a panic. The bank had pulled the financing. The closing was officially canceled until the title was cleared. I sat at my desk and looked out the window. I felt a cold, sharp wave of satisfaction. I had stopped the theft. I had forced them to acknowledge my existence and my boundaries. For a few brief hours, I thought I had won. I thought the frozen sale would force my parents and my sister back to the table, desperate to pay my invoice so they could salvage their lucrative real estate deal. I underestimated the depth of their entitlement. People who feel justified in their exploitation do not surrender when they are caught. They escalate. My parents did not view the lien as a legitimate collection of a debt. They viewed it as a hostile, unprovoked attack on their favorite child. Chloe did not call me to negotiate. She did not ask for a payment plan. Instead, she drove into Philadelphia and walked into the office of a high-powered commercial litigation firm. She could not afford a luxury litigator on her own. Her wellness boutique was still bleeding cash. My parents funded her counterattack. They took the modest liquid savings they had left in their retirement accounts and drained them to pay a massive legal retainer. They were literally financing a war against their eldest daughter to protect the stolen labor they gave to their youngest. 2 days later, a courier arrived at my office. He handed Sarah a thick manila envelope. Sarah brought it into my office and laid it on my desk. It was a rule to file complaint. It was a brutal, aggressive legal maneuver. Under Pennsylvania law, a property owner can challenge a mechanic lien to force the contractor hand. Chloe's lawyer was calling my bluff. The rule legally demanded that I either formally prove my case or walk away. This single piece of paper radically shifted the balance of power. It initiated a suffocating, strict statutory clock. I now had exactly 20 days to file a full-blown civil lawsuit to enforce the debt. Not a month, 20 days. If I failed to file the lawsuit within that aggressive window, the lien would be automatically dissolved by the court. The property title would clear. Chloe would be free to sell the house and pocket the money. The consequences of losing were severe. If the lien dissolved, I would be legally liable for Chloe attorney fees. I would be liable for damages caused by delaying her sale. The pressure cooker was on. The initial $15,000 retainer I paid David was just the entry fee. Filing a civil lawsuit meant entering the discovery phase. It meant formal depositions. It meant paying David $400 an hour to depose my own mother and father under oath. I was suddenly staring down the barrel of a multi-year court battle. My firm could not survive a multi-year distraction. We operated on tight margins and strict schedules. My reputation in the local construction industry was my most valuable asset. Bucks County is a small interconnected community of architects, suppliers, and developers. Public legal disputes make clients nervous. Homeowners do not want to hire a contractor who is currently embroiled in a bitter headline-making lawsuit against her own family. Chloe Lawyer knew this. The strategy was not just to win in court. The strategy was to bankrupt me before we ever saw a judge. They wanted to squeeze my operating capital so tightly that I would be forced to drop the lien just to keep my company solvent. I sat in my quiet office and traced the edge of the legal document with my thumb. The false victory was gone. I had backed them into a corner, but they had pulled a weapon. To survive the next 20 days, I had to prepare my business for a financial drought. I had to audit my own firm, cut expenses, and prepare for a siege. But the legal maneuvering was only the clinical side of the war. My parents realized that courtroom tactics take time. They needed a faster way to break my resolve. They needed to destroy my standing in the community. They decided to take the battle out of the legal system and bring it into our personal lives. The smear campaign was about to begin. Legal battles are fought inside sterile rooms with mahogany tables and court reporters. Family wars are fought in grocery store aisles, in church parking lots, and through voicemails. My parents knew they could not defeat my paper trail with a swift legal motion. Chloe's lawyer had filed the notice to contest my lien to drain my finances, but my parents needed a faster way to break my resolve. They needed to destroy my standing in the community. In a tight-knit suburban county, your professional reputation is your primary currency. My mother understood this perfectly. Helen Birdie is a retired elementary school administrator. She spent 3 decades building an intricate network of local business owners, parent-teacher association members, and neighborhood associations. She knew everyone, and everyone trusted her. She weaponized that network overnight. The fallout was toxic and immediate. I walked into my regular building supply depot on a Tuesday morning to price out cedar decking for a new client. I had been buying materials from this specific desk for 6 years. The manager, a man who usually greeted me by name and asked about my framing projects, barely looked at me. He kept his eyes on his computer screen. He handed me the printed estimate and mumbled something about how tough the current economy must be for retired folks facing eviction. I stood at the counter, confused. I asked him what he meant. He shifted his weight and said he heard I was trying to seize my elderly parents' only asset to fund my corporate expansion. My stomach dropped. My mother had not just spun a lie. She had engineered a comprehensive smear campaign. She was visiting local diners and hardware stores, painting a picture of a greedy, ruthless contractor daughter exploiting her vulnerable, fixed-income family. She told people I was trying to render my sister homeless over a simple misunderstanding. She conveniently omitted the secretly transferred deed. She erased the $150,000 I had pulled from my own credit lines. In her public narrative, I was a predator, and they were the tragic victims of my ambition. The social isolation spread rapidly. Extended family members, people I had not spoken to since my college graduation, began bombarding my phone. They had only heard my mother's tearful, curated version of events. My Aunt Lillian called me on a Thursday night. Lillian is my father's older sister. She lives 2 states away and communicates mostly through generic holiday cards. She did not text to ask for my side of the story. She bypassed inquiry entirely and left a 4-minute voicemail. I sat in the dark kitchen of my own house, the screen of my phone glowing on the counter, listening to her voice echo through the speaker. She was weeping. It was a loud, theatrical crying. She accused me of destroying the family legacy. She asked how I could sleep at night, knowing my parents were shivering in a rented apartment. And then she delivered a line that I will never forget. She said I was trying to ruin my sister's future over a few pieces of wood. A few pieces of wood. That is how my family summarized 8 months of specialized labor. That is how they categorized custom cabinetry, radiant floor heating, and structural steel beams. They reduced the massive financial theft to a petty squabble over lumber. The psychological depth of this betrayal was staggering. It took me weeks to realize the most terrifying truth about my parents. They were not acting. They were not sitting in their luxury apartment, twirling their mustaches and plotting my demise. They genuinely believed their own narrative. People who operate on extreme entitlement build robust cognitive defenses. To survive the guilt of stealing from me, my parents had to convince themselves that I deserved it. They had twisted the truth so tightly that my demand to be paid for my hard work was viewed as an act of profound cruelty. In their minds, family loyalty meant unconditional financial sacrifice. Because I refused to be their sacrificial lamb, I became the villain. They felt legitimately victimized by my boundary. The emotional cost of standing my ground was devastating. When you challenge a toxic family system, society often pushes back. The cultural expectation in America is that you forgive your parents no matter the transgression. Blood is thicker than water. Honor thy father and mother. People expect you to compromise your own survival to maintain the aesthetic of a happy family. I refused to compromise, and the consequence was total, crushing alienation. This isolation began to manifest physically. I lost my appetite. The thought of eating made me nauseous. I dropped 10 pounds in 3 weeks. My clothes hung loose on my frame. I stopped sleeping. I would lie awake at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling fan, calculating my dwindling operating reserves and wondering if the $15,000 legal retainer was going to bankrupt me. I existed entirely on black coffee and adrenaline. The stress did not stay contained in my house. It bled into my office, fraying my relationship with the only ally I had left. Sarah, my business partner, is a resilient woman, but she is responsible for our payroll. We were sitting in a budget meeting for an upcoming commercial build. We needed to focus on profit margins and vendor schedules. My phone buzzed on the conference table. It was another blocked number. Then it buzzed again. Another angry relative. Another text from a cousin calling me a parasite. Sarah put her pen down. She looked across the table. Her expression was hard. She told me my personal war was sinking our ship. I was distracted. I was missing minor details on supply orders. I was leaving the office early to sit in legal consultations. Our cash flow was restricted because of the money tied up in a lien. Sarah informed me that if I did not compartmentalize this disaster, she would have to rethink our partnership. She could not let my family drag her own livelihood underwater. I was entirely alone. I was fighting my parents. I was fighting my sister. I was fighting the rumor mill of my own town. And now I was on the verge of losing my business partner. The pressure cooker was operating at maximum capacity. Chloe's lawyer had planned for this. They wanted the isolation to break me. They wanted me to call my attorney, withdraw the lien, and surrender. I did not surrender. I survived that grueling 20-day window. David filed the formal civil lawsuit. The procedural machinery of the justice system engaged, locking us all into a path that could not be undone by a tearful phone call or a neighborhood rumor. The whispers in town grew louder, but I forced myself to ignore them. I stopped going to the local hardware store. I put my phone on silent. I focused all my remaining energy on the date circled in red ink on my office calendar. We were leaving the court of public opinion. We were entering a legally binding arena. My parents had spent weeks spinning brilliant lies to aunts and neighbors, but in 5 days, my father would have to sit across from a court reporter. He would have to swear an oath. And I was about to find out if he was willing to commit federal perjury to protect his golden child. The civil justice system operates at a glacial pace. After my attorney filed the lawsuit, the initial shock wore off, and months bled into a strange, stagnant routine. We officially entered the discovery phase. This is the period in a civil lawsuit where both sides are legally obligated to exchange evidence and conduct formal interviews. These structured interviews are called depositions. They are not held in grand courtrooms with wooden gavels and high ceilings. They happen in sterile, rented conference rooms. On a Tuesday morning, we gathered in a windowless office in downtown Doylestown. The carpet was a drab industrial gray. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone. At the head of the long veneer table sat a court reporter. Her hands rested over a small black stenography machine. She was there to type every single word spoken, turning our family tragedy into a permanent legal transcript. My parents walked into the room flanked by Chloe and her hired litigation attorney. They did not look at me when they entered. My father wore a navy blue suit he usually reserved for weddings and funerals. He looked older than the last time I saw him. His shoulders hunched forward, carrying a visible tension. For my entire life, Richard Birdie was a man who navigated around friction. If a restaurant got his order wrong, he ate the food anyway. If a neighbor blocked his driveway, he parked on the street. He surrendered his own comfort to avoid making a scene. Yet sitting in that gray room, he was preparing to commit a felony just to maintain the illusion of his perfect family. The court reporter asked him to stand and raise his right hand. He swore an oath to tell the truth. David started the questioning. My lawyer is methodical. He did not raise his voice. He began by establishing my father's identity, his residence, and his relationship to the property in question. Then David moved directly to the core issue. He asked my father to describe the exact financial arrangement regarding the first-floor renovation. I watched the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle adjust his silk tie. He cleared his throat. He looked at the blank wall just above my head, refusing to make eye contact. He stated, on the legal record, that there was never any promise of repayment. He told David that I had recognized my sister's failing retail business and generously volunteered my labor and capital as a family gift to secure her future. He did not stumble over the words. He delivered the lie with the practiced cadence of a rehearsed script. He claimed the discussion happened in his dining room over a Sunday roast. He fabricated a specific memory of me offering to waive all costs to save Chloe from bankruptcy. He wove a fiction where I was a selfless, wealthy benefactor, and they were merely the grateful recipients of my unprompted charity. Sitting 2 chairs away, Chloe adjusted the cuffs of her blouse. She kept her posture straight. Her face was set in an expression of quiet dignity. She was playing the victim flawlessly. When my father finished his statement, Chloe let out a soft sigh. It was a calculated sound, designed to make it seem as though recalling my supposed generosity filled her with sorrow over how greedy I had suddenly become. Next to her, my mother kept her hands folded on the table. Helen Birdie nodded slowly, validating the perjury with her silence. Hearing your own father lie under oath is a surreal experience. It does not invoke anger right away. It brings a profound physical numbness. Gaslighting is a term people use casually in modern culture to describe everyday disagreements, but formal systemic gaslighting is a different beast. It is the deliberate, coordinated dismantling of your reality. My family was sitting in a legal proceeding, using the power of sworn testimony to strip away my sanity. They were legally cementing a narrative where my boundaries were acts of sudden malice. The betrayal reached its lowest possible point in that sterile room. The theft of the money was a financial blow. The theft of the truth broke something inside me permanently. I sat frozen in my leather chair. My hands were resting on my lap, but my fingers felt numb. A heavy, suffocating doubt settled over my chest. I looked across the wooden table at the people who shared my DNA. I felt a wave of intense exhaustion wash over my body. I thought about the financial drain on my company. I thought about the lucrative design contracts I had lost because my focus was divided. I thought about the whispers spreading through my hometown, the hardware store managers who turned their backs when I walked in, and the sleepless nights staring at the ceiling. I silently asked myself if $150,000 was worth this agonizing psychological torture. Money can be earned again. A ruined nervous system takes years to heal. The capital they stole could buy 2 new work trucks or fund a junior architect's salary. But the process of getting it back was bankrupting my peace of mind. For a fleeting minute, the urge to surrender was overwhelming. I wanted to stand up, tell David to drop the lawsuit, and walk out into the Pennsylvania sunlight. I wanted to give them the victory, just to stop the bleeding. David was reviewing a page of printed notes. He did not look up, but he sensed the shift in my posture. He knew the specific tactic Chloe's lawyer was deploying. They wanted the emotional weight of the perjury to crush my resolve. Underneath the heavy table, entirely out of sight from the court reporter and the opposing counsel, David reached over and squeezed my forearm. It was a brief, firm grip, a physical anchor in a room full of smoke and mirrors. It was his way of telling me to hold the line. He knew I was breaking. He reminded me silently that we were in an arena governed by facts, not feelings. That single pressure grounded me. The fog of doubt burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp focus. I looked at my father's face again. I saw the slight tremor in his jaw. I noticed how his hands gripped the armrests of his chair tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. He was lying, and it was costing him his dignity. I realized the nature of the legal battle had morphed. It was no longer a simple dispute over unpaid construction invoices. It was no longer about the brass cabinet hardware or the radiant floor heating. It was a battle for objective truth. If I walked away now, their fabricated history would become the permanent record. They would spend the rest of their lives telling everyone they knew how they survived the cruelty of their eldest daughter. I could not let them rewrite my life to cover their theft. I owed myself the dignity of fighting back. I took a slow breath. I nodded once to David. He released my arm and sat back up straight. The court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over her keys, waiting for the next phase of questioning. Chloe's lawyer leaned back in his chair, a smug expression settling on his features. He thought he had won. He believed the precarious nature of a verbal contract had just been successfully buried by a father's sworn testimony. He thought we had nothing left but my word against an entire united family. He did not know about the municipal permitting process. He did not know that a standard, boring, bureaucratic necessity had quietly generated a trap they could not escape, and David was just about to spring it. Chloe's lawyer was a man who understood the theatrical nature of the legal system. As my father finished his perjured testimony, the lawyer leaned back in his leather chair. He folded his hands over his stomach. He looked at my attorney with an expression of manufactured pity. He believed he had won. He was confident he had beaten us on the treacherous ground of a he-said-she-said dispute. The 3 text messages David had found were helpful, but in the eyes of this litigation expert, they were vague enough to be argued away by a skilled defense. A text message can be spun. A sworn oath from a respected elderly homeowner asserting a gift is a massive hurdle for any judge to clear. The lawyer thought he had buried my claim under the weight of my own family united lies. But lawyers who spend their lives inside air-conditioned offices often fail to understand the gritty, bureaucratic reality of the construction industry. They look at a house and see an asset. A general contractor looks at a house and sees a paper trail. You cannot alter a structure in the state of Pennsylvania without leaving a permanent, trackable footprint in the municipal archives. They forgot about the permitting process. Before you pour a single yard of concrete or frame a single wall, you have to submit architectural plans to the local township. The township issues permits based on zoning laws. These laws dictate everything from the height of your roof to how far your back patio sits from your neighbor's fence. It is a rigid, unforgiving system, and it generates a mountain of paperwork. In the 3rd month of the renovation, we hit a structural snag. My parents wanted to expand the rear footprint of the house. They asked me to build a new 12 by 20-foot composite deck off the kitchen. I drew up the plans and submitted the permit application to the local zoning board. A week later, the municipal inspector flagged the application. The proposed deck extended 3 feet past the rear property setback line. To build it, we needed to apply for a formal zoning variance. A contractor cannot authorize a zoning variance on their own. The municipal government requires the legal deed holder to sign the application under penalty of perjury. At that time, my parents still owned the house. The secret transfer to Chloe was months away. I needed their signatures quickly. Weather delays were already pushing my schedule back, and I had a crew of carpenters waiting for the green light. On a Tuesday afternoon, I called my mother. She did not answer. I called my father's cell phone. It went to voicemail. Knowing he was at his corporate office in Philadelphia, I sat in the cab of my truck, opened my laptop, and drafted an email. I did not send it to his personal account. I sent it to his secure corporate email address, attaching the township variance forms as a digital document file. When a project manager writes an email to a client regarding a delay, they do not use emotional language. They use financial leverage. They remind the client what is at stake to force immediate action. That is exactly what I did with my father. I typed a brief, direct message. I told him to please sign the attached municipal forms immediately so we did not delay the framing crew. I wrote that I was already $60,000 out of pocket on the material costs. I explicitly stated that I needed to finish this phase on time so we could trigger the bank appraisal and so he could reimburse me through the home equity line of credit. It was a standard administrative email. It was not a trap. It was just the daily communication of a business owner trying to keep a construction schedule from falling apart. 14 minutes later, my father replied from his desk. His response traveled through his company's server, creating an immutable digital timestamp. His email was equally direct. He wrote that the forms were signed and attached. He told me not to worry. He addressed me by name. He wrote that I would get every penny back from the loan. He ended it by thanking me for my hard work. This was not a convenient coincidence. This was not a lucky break. It was the natural byproduct of doing business in a highly regulated industry. Bureaucracy forces honesty on paper. Back in the sterile deposition room, the silence following my father's sworn testimony was heavy. The court reporter hands rested on her machine. Chloe's lawyer was already packing his notes into his leather briefcase, preparing to end the session on a victorious note. David did not look at me. He calmly reached into his own leather bag. He pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. It was not a blurry screenshot of a text message. It was a crisp, clear printout of that corporate email exchange, complete with the routing headers, the exact timestamps, and my father's official company signature block. David slid the piece of paper across the long wooden table. He stopped it precisely in front of Chloe's lawyer. David spoke in a flat, conversational tone. He asked the lawyer to review the document and enter it into the formal record as Exhibit D. The lawyer stopped packing his briefcase. He picked up the paper. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched his pupils track back and forth across the page. It took him exactly 10 seconds to read the exchange. The physical transformation of the man was incredible to witness. The manufactured pity vanished. The smugness evaporated. His posture went entirely rigid. He was a seasoned litigator and he recognized a fatal wound the second he saw one. He knew immediately that this email could not be argued away. It was sent from a verifiable corporate server. It contained the exact dollar amount spent up to that date. It outlined the exact mechanism of the planned repayment. And it contained a direct, undeniable promise to pay the debt. More importantly, the lawyer realized what his own clients had just done. He slowly lowered the paper. He looked at my father. The lawyer's face was devoid of color. 10 minutes ago, he was defending a family against a greedy contractor. Now he was sitting next to a man who had just committed textbook perjury on the legal record. My father leaned forward and tried to read the document upside down. When he recognized his own corporate email signature, his jaw went slack. The flush of blood left his cheeks. He suddenly looked like a very old, very fragile man. He looked at my mother. Helen Birdie stared blankly at the table, her hands trembling slightly. Chloe, sensing the sudden shift in the room atmosphere, leaned over and read the email. The cold, dignified mask she had worn all morning shattered. She sank back into her chair, her shoulders collapsing. The golden child finally realized that her parents' protection had limits, and a federal court reporter was not one of them. The legal battle had just pivoted on a single axis. We were no longer fighting over an ambiguous verbal agreement. We had ironclad proof of intent. But the danger for my family was far worse than a lost lawsuit. By transferring the deed to Chloe after generating this email, my parents had actively engaged in a fraudulent conveyance to dodge a known creditor. David let the silence hang in the room for a full minute. He let them marinate in the reality of their own destruction. Then, he looked directly at the opposing counsel and asked if he had any further questions for his client regarding the nature of the alleged gift. The lawyer did not answer David. He abruptly stood up. He shoved the email into his briefcase and snapped it shut. His voice was sharp, professional, and entirely panicked. He looked at the court reporter and stated that he was calling for an immediate recess. He grabbed my father by the elbow, instructing his clients not to say another word. They rushed out of the conference room, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. I sat at the table next to David. I felt the tension drain from my neck. The agonizing doubt that had almost broken me an hour earlier was completely gone. I knew what was happening in the hallway outside. A lawyer does not pull his clients out of a deposition unless he is reading them the riot act. He was currently informing them that if this went to a judge, they would not just lose the house, they could face criminal charges for fraud and perjury. The siege was over. My family had built a legal fortress out of lies, and a single sheet of paper had just burned it to the ground. They had nowhere left to hide, and their only option now was to beg for the very thing they had spent months refusing to give me. The desperation mediation was about to begin. The email entered the official discovery record on a Thursday. The effect was immediate. But the law was only one half of the pressure. The real estate market was the other. Chloe Buyer, a young couple relocating from New Jersey, had grown tired of living out of suitcases in a hotel. Their mortgage rate lock was set to expire. They issued an ultimatum to the listing agent. Clear the clouded title by Friday afternoon, or they were pulling their earnest money and walking away. This threat shifted the leverage entirely. The luxury litigation firm could not delay the process anymore. They needed the mechanic lien dissolved in 48 hours, or there would be no $650,000 payday to fight over. The opposing counsel requested an emergency mediation session. Mediation is a mandatory step in civil litigation, designed to unclog court dockets by forcing warring parties to negotiate a compromise before a judge gets involved. We met at a neutral location, a shared workspace building near the county courthouse. The room smelled like ozone from the copy machine down the hall. A retired circuit judge served as the neutral mediator. He sat at the head of a glass table, reviewing the case file. My parents sat across from me. Chloe was not there. They had left her behind, perhaps realizing her smug presence was a liability. The aggressive posturing from the deposition was gone. They had replaced their arrogance with a performance of profound tragedy. My father looked visibly diminished. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like parchment. My mother refused to make eye contact with my attorney. The mediator explained the ground rules. He noted the corporate email exchange entered into evidence. He stated bluntly that the defense was in a perilous position, facing potential fraud exposure if the case proceeded to trial. He asked if the defense had a proposal to resolve the dispute. The opposing lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth glass. It stopped directly in front of me. I picked up the paper. It was a formal settlement offer. They were proposing a lump sum payment of $50,000 wired to my business account upon the successful closing of the property. In exchange, I would immediately sign a release dissolving the mechanic lien and drop the civil lawsuit. I stared at the number printed in black ink. $50,000. I had spent $150,000 of my company capital on lumber, custom tile, and subcontractor labor. I had just paid David a $15,000 retainer to fight the lawsuit they initiated. They were offering to return roughly 1/3 of what they stole, asking me to absorb a six-figure loss to save their golden child. I placed the paper back on the table. Before David could reject it, my mother began to cry. These were not the loud, theatrical sobs of my aunt on the voicemail. This was a quiet, suffocating weeping. She pulled a tissue from her purse and pressed it against her eyes. Her shoulders shook. She looked across the table, speaking directly to me for the first time in months. She said they were ruined. She explained that Chloe commercial landlord had filed an eviction notice that morning. If this house sale fell through, Chloe would lose her boutique, and my parents would lose their retirement savings paying the legal penalties. She begged me to accept the money. She pleaded with me to remember that we were a family. She weaponized her vulnerability, using the very maternal fragility she knew I had spent my entire life trying to protect. The psychological trap was brilliantly laid. They were no longer fighting me with lawyers, they were fighting me with guilt. Sitting in that cold room, listening to the woman who raised me weep into her hands, my resolve wavered. I was so profoundly exhausted. My business was suffering. My partnership with Sarah was fracturing. My nervous system was fried from months of hypervigilance. The idea of taking the $50,000 and just walking away felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. It was a terrible offer, but it represented an immediate end to the nightmare. It meant I could sleep through the night. It meant I could go back to building houses instead of building legal cases. I looked at David. I opened my mouth to tell him to draft the acceptance paperwork. David recognized the collapse. He reads people for a living. He saw my posture soften. He saw the dangerous empathy creeping into my eyes. He stood up, interrupting the silence. He told the mediator we needed 5 minutes in private. He did not wait for an answer. He grabbed my elbow and guided me out of the conference room, down the carpeted hallway, and into an empty break room. He shut the door. The sound of the ventilation unit hummed overhead. David stood between me and the door. He did not offer comfort. He offered a brutal, necessary reality check. He asked me to do the math out loud. I stood by the coffee machine and recited the numbers. $150,000 in hard costs, $15,000 in legal retainers, lost revenue from the municipal contract I missed. The sum was approaching $200,000. David pointed a finger at the wall separating us from my parents. He explained that accepting $50,000 was not a compromise. It was a capitulation. It was paying for the privilege of being abused. He lowered his voice, forcing me to listen closely. He said that if I accepted their offer, the remaining debt would sink my company. I would have to lay off my framing crew. I would have to default on my commercial credit lines. He reminded me that my parents were not crying because they regretted stealing from me. They were crying because their safety net had holes in it. They were still prioritizing Chloe failing luxury boutique over my solvent construction firm. They were asking me to bankrupt myself so the golden child could avoid the consequences of her own financial incompetence. The tears were real, but the motive was entirely self-serving. The fog of familial guilt lifted. The hard math acted as a solvent, washing away the emotional manipulation. They had pushed me to the edge of ruin, and now they wanted a discount on the damage. David watched my expression harden. He asked if I was ready to go back inside. I nodded. I smoothed the wrinkles from my suit jacket. We walked out of the break room and back down the hallway. The illusion of the settlement trap had failed. I was no longer the dependable daughter seeking validation. I was a creditor returning to the table to collect a debt, and I was about to lay out the final terms of their surrender. We walked back into the conference space. The air felt stale, heavy with the recycled breath of desperate people, and the faint ozone smell of the copy machine down the hall. My mother had stopped her theatrical weeping during our brief absence. She held a damp tissue, her eyes tracking my movements as I approached the seating arrangement. She expected me to pull out my chair, pick up a pen, and sign away my livelihood. She assumed the hallway conversation had worn down my defenses, allowing the familiar weight of familial obligation to crush my resistance. I stood behind my chair. I did not sit. Maintaining a standing position alters the physical power dynamic in a room, forcing the seated parties to look up, physically acknowledging your authority. I reached across the smooth glass surface and placed my fingertips on the printed document containing their insulting proposal. I slid the paper back toward them. It made a soft scraping sound before coming to a rest inches from my father's folded hands. I stripped all emotion from my voice. I spoke in a flat, detached cadence, delivering my terms not as a grieving daughter, but as a project manager reviewing a delinquent commercial account. I told them the $50,000 offer was rejected. My mother inhaled sharply, a calculated sound designed to project victimization, but I raised my hand to stop her from speaking. I told them I was done financing their delusions. I explained how the concept of kinship had always operated as a one-directional street in our household. I reminded them of the time, 6 years ago, when their roof suffered severe storm damage. They lacked the insurance deductible. I paid the roofing crew out of my own pocket. They called it an investment in the family legacy. When their furnace died 2 winters ago, I bought and installed a high-efficiency unit. They called it taking care of your elders. I had spent my entire adult life subsidizing their emergencies under the guise of duty. But this situation was not an emergency. This was premeditated theft. I looked directly at the man who raised me and stated the new reality. I told him I was no longer a charity. I was a creditor. And creditors do not subsidize fraud. I laid out the arithmetic, ensuring every syllable landed like a hammer blow. I recited the invoices from the specialty lumber mill in Lancaster. I quoted the exact price of the custom copper plumbing lines I ran through their subfloor. I reminded them of the hefty legal retainer currently sitting in my attorney's escrow account. I explained that cash flow is the lifeblood of a design firm. My company was already turning away lucrative municipal bids because my operating capital was tied up in their property. Accepting a fraction of the debt meant I would be bankrolling my sister's failing wellness boutique with my own employees' paychecks. I refused to set myself on fire to keep Chloe warm. The room fell profoundly silent. The mediator, a retired circuit court judge named Harrison, watched the exchange with an impassive expression. He possessed a face weathered by 3 decades of presiding over bitter civil disputes. He did not care about our childhood dynamics, maternal tears, or broken trust. He cared about statute, precedent, and actionable evidence. Judge Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He addressed the opposing counsel briefly, then shifted his stern gaze to my parents. His voice was gravelly and devoid of any sympathy. He informed them that my refusal to compromise was not merely a moral stance, it was a flawless legal strategy. He pointed his pen at the printed email sitting in the center of the table. Exhibit D. He told my father that if this dispute proceeded to a formal trial, the defense would be decimated. The written acknowledgement of the loan, combined with the detailed timeline of the construction process, stripped away any plausible deniability regarding a verbal contract. The judge broke down the exact mechanics of their impending ruin. He explained that a trial would result in a swift ruling favoring my firm. The court would uphold the mechanic's lien without hesitation, but the consequences would extend much further. The court would mandate a forced public sale of the property to satisfy the $150,000 debt. My parents would lose all control over the listing price and the timeline. Furthermore, the judge noted, they would be held legally liable for every penny of my attorney fees, adding tens of thousands of dollars to their deficit. Then, Judge Harrison delivered the final, devastating reality check. He brought up the quitclaim deed. He noted the specific date my parents transferred the property ownership to Chloe. The transaction occurred exactly 3 weeks after my father sent the email acknowledging the financial debt he owed me. In the eyes of a civil court, the judge explained, transferring a major asset to a close relative immediately after incurring a substantial debt is not a clever loophole. It is the textbook definition of a fraudulent conveyance. It is an illegal attempt to hide assets from a known creditor. Judge Harrison looked my father directly in the eye and stated that pursuing a trial would expose them to severe punitive damages. It could easily trigger a formal referral to the district attorney for criminal fraud investigation. The facade shattered instantly. The careful narrative my mother had spun through our hometown, the tragic story of the greedy contractor daughter abusing her vulnerable parents, evaporated under the harsh light of judicial reality. There was nowhere left for them to hide their entitlement. They had tried to outsmart the system, and instead, they had built a cage of their own making. They were cornered by their own greed. The physical transformation of my parents was stark. My father's shoulders slumped, pulling his chest inward. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving a gray, hollow complexion. He suddenly appeared incredibly frail, a man realizing his public legacy would be defined by perjury and theft. My mother stopped clutching her tissue. The manufactured panic vanished, replaced by cold, unadulterated terror. She looked at her hired attorney, silently begging him to offer a counter-argument, a legal loophole, or a magic trick to save them from ruin. The luxury litigator said nothing. He kept his hands folded over his legal pad. He knew the judge was correct. His job was to mitigate damage, and the only mitigation left on the table was unconditional surrender. He looked at his clients and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the visual confirmation of their total defeat. They had no cards left to play. The New Jersey buyers had a strict deadline looming. The title remained clouded by my lien. The criminal exposure was laid bare on the glass table for everyone to see. They had to capitulate to my original terms. But yielding to my demands meant destroying the very rescue mission they had sacrificed me for. The golden child's payday was about to vanish, and the collateral damage of their surrender would wipe out everything they had fought to protect. Faced with total, catastrophic ruin inside a courtroom, the defense collapsed. Chloe's hired lawyer did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate the sum down. He understood the severity of the leverage sitting on the glass table. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of blank legal forms, and began drafting an ironclad settlement agreement. The terms were non-negotiable. Chloe, as the legal owner of the deed, was forced to capitulate. She had to sign a binding document acknowledging the full, unreduced debt. The agreement stipulated that exactly $150,427 would be intercepted directly from the title company escrow account on the day of closing and wired straight into my firm commercial bank account. I did not have to trust them to cut a check. The money would never even touch my sister's hands. I watched my father sign his name as a witness. His signature was shaky. I watched Chloe's lawyer slide the paperwork across the table for David to review. The mechanical process of securing my capital was complete. I signed the release forms, agreeing to drop the civil lawsuit and dissolve the mechanic lien, only upon the confirmed receipt of the wire transfer. We walked out of the mediation center. My parents did not say a word to me in the parking lot. They drove away in silence. I had forced them to balance the ledger, but the damage they had caused themselves during the process was profound and irreversible. They had assumed they could control the timeline of the housing market. They assumed wrong. The legal delay poisoned their real estate transaction. Their initial buyers walked. By the time Chloe finally found a new buyer months later, the market had cooled, and the house sold for a fraction of their triumphant asking price. After the title company forcefully extracted my $150,427, and Chloe's luxury litigation lawyer took his massive cut, the golden child's payday evaporated. It was not enough to save her boutique, which went bankrupt weeks later. My parents, having signed away their only asset, were forced into a cramped rented duplex on the loud side of town. The middle-class reputation my mother had spent decades curating crumbled the moment the public bankruptcy and court records hit the neighborhood grapevine. They traded a peaceful retirement and a loyal daughter for a temporary illusion of control, and they ended up with nothing. When the wire transfer finally hit my commercial account, replenishing my credit lines down to the last dollar, I didn't celebrate, but I didn't mourn either. The physical artifacts of the war are gone now. The highlighted receipts are locked away in a basement filing cabinet, and the drywall dust is permanently scrubbed from my hands. I am sitting at my drafting table right now. The afternoon sun is casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of my office. Spread out in front of me are the architectural blueprints for a modern farmhouse build. The clients are a young couple expecting their first child. Resting on top of the blueprints is a thick stack of paper. It is a master service agreement. It contains 20 pages of explicitly defined terms, payment schedules, and liability clauses. Every single page bears the wet ink signature of the client. There are no handshake deals in this room anymore. There are no assumptions of unearned generosity. There is only clear, documented mutual respect. Standing up to a toxic family system requires a toll few people are willing to pay. The cost of admission to my own life was the complete severance of my past. But the peace I feel in this office, surrounded by the hum of a healthy business and the unbreakable clarity of a written contract, is worth every single agonizing second of the fight. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had your labor weaponized by the people who were supposed to protect you, I'm glad you stayed to the end. Leave a comment below with the word boundary so I know you're with me. Tap subscribe, and there is another story waiting for you in the description about a sister-in-law, a stolen inheritance, and a forensic audit that changed everything. Come back tomorrow. I'll put the kettle on.